Welcome to Railfans. I'm Shane Sege. Join us as we discover the Ottawa O Train, Toronto Subway, and Montreal Metro systems together. I'm Shane Sege, and joining me today is Pat Scrimgeour, Director of Transit, Customer Systems, and Planning. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Shane.
So today we're going to be talking about OC Transpo's transition from diesel to zero-emission buses. Obviously, this is a big deal for customers, for the city, for the transit operator, and for the environment. So can you tell us a little bit about, just to start, what are the benefits and what's the importance of transitioning to a zero-emission fleet?
Well, the first benefit prior is the fact that they are zero-emission buses, that there's no local emissions coming out of the internal combustion engine on that bus. So reduced fossil fuel consumption and a contribution to the city's goal of becoming emission-free by 2050. By that date in the future, as we contribute to the city's looking at all of the things that it does to see what it can do first, what it can do right away to bring down the emissions and to contribute to finding a resolution to the climate change that's going on.
So the technology chosen thus far to enable this conversion are battery electric buses. So can you explain a little bit about what informed this decision as compared to other technologies in the report? Electric trolley buses, hydrogen fuel cells. So what made the electric battery bus the best option?
So we set out to find two recommendations for council. The first was, what should the energy source be? What source should the energy be derived from? And the second is, how should that be delivered or carried on the bus? So the first question was, we're using primarily diesel fuel now. Are there other fuels we can use that would have zero or fewer emissions? So there's a range of possibilities in natural gas, and but they don't bring you to zero emission. That you can have reduced emissions. You can generate that gas more in a more environmentally friendly way, but it doesn't bring it to zero. We looked at hybrid buses, newer buses. We've just retired our 12, 13-year-old hybrid buses, but with modern technology, can we do better? And again, you'd reduce your diesel consumption, but you don't get to zero emissions. So that drove us towards electricity being the way to being the energy source that we needed to use in order to meet the policy direction of council and the funding criteria from the federal government. And then we looked at several ways of getting that electricity. So there's battery electric buses, there's trolley buses, and there's hydrogen fuel cell as a way of generating the electricity on the bus to turn the wheels. Right now, trolley buses, very common in the 1950s as a way of making a transition from streetcar to bus before internal combustion engines had the power they did, and when that infrastructure was already in place in a lot of cities. And trolley buses have hung on in Vancouver and hung on longer in places like Toronto, Edmonton, and Hamilton, but were gone pretty quickly in Ottawa. Through the 60s and 70s, left all those other cities like Kitchener, Waterloo, Calgary, Halifax, Fort William, Port Arthur, Saskatoon, Winnipeg, all the other cities across the country that had trolley buses. When we look at them now, and you can compare them to battery electric buses, you get much more range with a trolley bus. You don't have to charge it. You don't, on the other hand, with battery electric bus, you don't have to put up an infrastructure along the whole route. And because, or apparently because more transit agencies are buying electric buses than trolley buses, they are becoming more of an off-the-shelf product from the manufacturers rather than a custom order with higher prices. So we looked at trolley buses, but you can't put overhead wires on every route. You'd have to choose them for the main routes only, maybe the Transitway, Bank Street, Montreal Road, Baseline Road, streets like that. but that doesn't get you to 100% fleet conversion. You would still need to find another way of having that bus that goes through Westboro or through Fallingbrook or through down to Hopeside Road in Canada, because you can't wire up every street in the city, or you could, but it would be very expensive. So the buses are more expensive, the infrastructure is expensive, and that ruled that out. Hydrogen fuel cells are interesting and a possibility, but they're not the mainstream right now. They'd have higher range than a battery electric bus. Between fueling, you could go further before you have to bring it back, but the buses are currently more expensive. The hydrogen has to be generated somehow, and there's no sources of hydrogen right now in Ottawa. So the hydrogen would have to be trucked in or brought in by train from some distance away from, wherever it is they're producing it. And then you have to question how they are producing that hydrogen as well. And is that hydrogen production itself emission-free? Now, we didn't get into that very much because though it would get us to zero emission, with the buses being less proven, more expensive, and the fuel being scarce in this area, battery electric buses were clearly the way that it was the most achievable to do in the shortest term. We don't have to wait for more testing to be done. We can certainly expect that there'll be more development in batteries, but after that fairly thorough search, that's what we recommended to council, is that battery electric buses are what they can do right now. Now, what we also recommended is the technologies are going to change. Fuel cell technology is going to change. Hydrogen availability may change. Other things may come along. And so we should do a refresh of that search that we did after 5 years. So, to continue on to the story of just a little bit, our buses, we buy them for 15-year life cycle. So the buses that we buy for the next 5 years is really the first third of the 15 years that it will take to replace every bus that we have. We can replace almost half of our fleet in those years just because of the way purchases went 15 years ago.
So the federal government recently announced 2 funding programs to encourage transit systems to convert to zero-emission buses. And I'm just going to read them very briefly. So the first is loans through the Canada Infrastructure Bank to fund a higher capital cost and pay the loan from lower operating costs during the life of the bus. And the second one, grants through Infrastructure Canada programs to cover infrastructure upgrades and transition costs. So obviously the infrastructure, the charging, the electrical capacity. So can you tell us, how does this recent news play into the future bus purchases, and how is the transition envisioned to proceed over the next 15 years?
So these 2 funding processes are critical. They were crucial to our recommendations. We didn't have a way to recommend to council a financially sustainable way to convert our bus fleet until these funding arrangements were announced by the federal government. The first one from the Canada Infrastructure Bank is really important because one of the things, apart from technology, that's holding transit systems back is that battery electric buses are very expensive. They're almost twice as expensive as a diesel bus. And you have to put the money together to buy that bus. And it's not in anyone's financial plan. Long term, you can pay for it because the operating costs are going to be about 40% lower, but the capital costs are much higher. So what the CIB program does is loans the municipality or the transit system the money, and it gets paid back over the life of the bus from the operating cost savings. So that's absolutely crucial to us to be able to make that recommendation to City Council. The second part, the Infrastructure Canada funding that has been announced, we're still waiting to hear the details of the funding program, is also very important because it covers some of the one-time costs that we're going to incur. We have to refit our bus garages to handle one type of bus rather than another. So because, for instance, we've got to beef up our electrical capacity on site. I mean, the hydro system has to bring us the electricity, but on site right now we're running machines and lights and computers off electricity. We have to change that because we're bringing in a lot more electricity to go to, not rapidly, but a lot of current has to go into those buses to charge the batteries. And there's physical things we have to do. The pantographs that will come down from the ceiling to hit the contacts on the front of the bus to charge the bus. We need more, we need more support up in the ceiling for those pantographs to come down. Long term, after we've got rid of all diesel buses, there'll be another transitional funding source because we'll want to take out things like fuel tanks and change our ventilation system. The other big piece of work, the transition costs, is we've got computer systems we have to add to or revise so that they're, for instance, the maintenance tracking system for the buses, the dispatch planner of when the buses go out, when do the buses come back, how many kilometers is it going to travel, how much of a charge is it going to have when it comes back, when's the right time to charge that bus, what's the right time to do for battery health. Mechanics who are licensed diesel mechanics, we have to get them to be just as skilled on maintaining a bus with a different energy source. There'll be different buses to drive, so all the operators will have to go through the training. All the mechanical support staff will have some level of training, and there will be more than that as we go through this project.
We talked about the hybrid buses briefly there. You made mention of the hybrid buses. They were acquired back around 2007, 2008. There has been, and it has been stated that they didn't achieve the efficiency levels that were projected at the time. Can you explain a little bit why those didn't achieve the efficiency that you had hoped for, and how electric buses are envisioned to do better than that moving forward?
The hybrid buses were purchased because they were to reduce fuel consumption and to save money as a result. They worked as buses. They didn't achieve those savings to the degree that was projected. And that's likely primarily because battery technology of 12 years ago, 12 and earlier, the battery, it became a major cost to keep those battery systems running, to keep them supported by the manufacturer. The manufacturer had moved on to other technologies, and so ours became a bit of a, like I was saying earlier, a bit of an orphan, not only in the fleet, but in the fleet that they had sold. We're early in. Nobody's gone through a complete life cycle on a modern battery electric bus, nor can they ever, because by the time anyone buys these buses, us or any other city, we're buying the bus that are available now. We won't know all the lessons about these buses until we retire them 15 years down the road. But we will learn as we go through. And if these buses are not performing as well as they should, we'll make sure that we've got language, warranty, contractual language that shares that responsibility back to the manufacturer. If there are things we learn about how to operate these buses which are different from what we know right now, we'll change and operate in those ways. And if the battery technology or the power distribution technology improves in the next 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, so the buses become longer range, as we expect, well, then the buses that we buy later will be the ones that go out on the longer work blocks, and the buses that we bought earlier will go on some of the work blocks that are more appropriate for their capabilities.
So I'm going to now refer to the report to council that was delivered. So it stated that, and coming back to your point, to manage battery degradation, buses can be stored with lower states of charge and by avoiding their maximum range every day. So for planning purposes, the effective range of the 40-foot battery electric bus is 286 kilometers, an estimation that will help preserve battery life and cover approximately 60% of the current schedule blocks for 40-foot buses. So my question to you now is, and just for perspective, what would you say is the current average distance or length of a bus route in Ottawa? And what would be the average distance a bus travels in an average day?
I mean, I don't have the average length of a bus route, but what I can say is, as the O-Train system expands, the average length of an individual route or trip is becoming shorter. Before Line 1 opened, we had routes like the old 94, the old 96, 94, 95, very long routes going all the way from Orleans to Barrhaven. 96, different because it was a very high speed route. It spent a lot of its time on the highway and on the transitway. As the train replaces the trunk, and especially as stage 2 comes in, all of the routes are becoming more local. They're not running such a long distance on the transitway. The replacement, think of the east end of the old 95. Right now it's the 39. Once the train goes to Trim, that's a little feeder route into Trim Station. At the other end, there will be buses that run from all through Barrhaven that just go to Algonquin Station. Canada, those buses which now come all the way into Tunney's on the highway and on the transitway, they'll just be coming into Moody Station. So they'll be on the highway for a few kilometers, but not the long distance they have now. So buses will become a little more of a quick turnaround, a little more of a slower average operating speed, a little more of a grind. They're working all the time. They're in the local areas. That changes the nature of what we do now, both in capacity and in energy source, because they won't have the long nonstop runs on the 417 or 174 or on the transitway that they used to have. They're much more stop and go through arterial roads and local areas. We've got buses that go out, all of our buses, except for the ones that have been overnight, go out first thing in the morning. They're going out at 5, 6, 7 in the morning, and they're running for, some of them are coming back, maybe 2/3 of them are coming back after the morning rush hour around 8:30 to 9:30. About a third of them are staying out all day long. And then most of those 2/3 that came in the morning will go out again in the afternoon. So they'll go out at about 2:30 to 3:30, do their afternoon's work, and start coming in at 6:30, 7 o'clock. And then a few buses, much lower number than in rush hours, are staying out for the evening service, and then they gradually come in as the night goes on. Those long day buses, the ones that go out at 6 in the morning and come in at 7 at night, or go out at 5 in the morning, come in at 7 at night, they're out for 13 hours. Those aren't going to be the ones that we can convert to electric buses in this first year, while the range is as short. The other buses that go out for a long time are the buses that go out at maybe 3 in the afternoon and stay out till midnight. Those are a little shorter, and we'll see how we can do those. But the ones we know we can convert are the trippers, the buses that go out first thing in the morning, come back after the morning rush hour, or go out and then go out again in the mid-afternoon and come back in the early evening. Those will be the ones that we can convert with those first buses that come. And then as the technology changes, it either changes and the ranges get longer, or we move into another choice. If the battery electric buses that we buy 4 years from now, 7 years from now, still can't handle 7 hours, 12 hours of operation, then we'll have two basic choices. One is to start charging buses out in the field, as they're testing in Montreal and Vancouver, where the bus goes out and then it pauses for a few minutes and it gets hit with a big, quick charge when it's parked at a bus loop or at a transit station, and then just enough juice for another half hour or 45 minutes, do another trip, and then plug it in again. Or we'll change the structure of our work blocks and have those buses come back and get swapped out with a bus that's already back at the garage and charged and ready to go. Either of those is going to have additional costs. Bringing the bus back into the garage is going to be another deadhead trip with the bus. So maybe it's a half hour to bring the bus in, swap out, half hour to go out with another bus. There's an hour of time that we'll have to spend that we don't have to spend right now with diesel buses. If it's charging buses out at transit, imagine, I don't know, I'm thinking Terry Fox Station or Herdman Station or somewhere like that, where the buses are always coming into that station. We can have them charge while they're dropping off and picking up customers, or we could have them go over to the layup area and charge there. But if they have to sit for longer than our normal recovery time for that bus, longer than what it takes to drop off the customers, pick up the customers, and have that bus, have enough buffer time to be sure that it goes out on time. If it's longer than that it takes to charge a bus, then that's new time that we're going to have to budget for. Plus, we'd have to have the capital cost of putting those chargers out at those locations too, and if necessary, the cost of getting the electricity to those locations. So, garage charging with the long range buses is clearly the best way to go for the beginning, and with more experience and with technology improvements, we'll see how we go in the years further along. Now, there's another issue we have to deal with when we're charging in the midday, is that we've got to make sure we're not contributing to the provincial-wide global peak energy requirement. Now, I don't know about this very much. We got experts who work at the city, and they know much more about it than I do. But as I understand it, it's warm days in the afternoon during the summer when all across the province our electricity use is at its highest. And so we've got to make sure that we are never charging a bus at that time of day, because we know we're contributing to a greater need in our garages. We know we're contributing to a greater need for transmission facilities to bring that electricity to us, but we don't want to be changing, putting upward pressure on the peak supply of electricity to the city of Ottawa, and we don't want to be putting upward pressure on the need for more electricity to be generated in Ontario. So the more that we can shift the charging time off peak, then it doesn't matter when we spend that energy. We can be driving a bus during a hot day at 5 in the afternoon and not be contributing to the global peak, because we charged that bus back at 1 in the afternoon, or we charged that bus the previous night. And that ties in to some of that software I was talking about earlier. We know the principles, we're going to build the principles in, but when we get to the point that we're charging 1,000 buses, we'll start with 74 plus the 4 we have coming this year. We'll grow to 500, but when we've got 1,000 buses, we got to make sure we're managing them all properly, and that's why we got to have some good software to make sure that we're making good decisions.
So we touched on the fact that OC Transpo operates a very diverse fleet of buses, consisting of the 40-foot conventional bus, the 60-foot articulated double-decker, as well as the minibuses for Transpo. With stage 2 expanding further east, west, and south, we're going to be seeing O-train stations for 80% of the population within about 5 kilometers. So that obviously creates opportunities, like you were mentioning, of shorter routes and all that. So will we still see many routes doing cross-city, or is that really going to be a thing of the past?
There's certainly going to be a lot less of it. We'll still have crosstown routes. We'll still have long routes that go around downtown or through downtown. So like Route 88, the old 118, that'll still be a long route going all the way from Herdman to Terry Fox. We'll have in-town routes like Route 7, which is still a pretty long route, looping all the way from Saint Laurent through downtown and down to Carleton. We're starting with 40-foot buses because they're what's available. 60-foot articulated buses are coming along. They're being built, they're being offered by the manufacturers. They don't currently have quite the range. They aren't currently as there isn't as much experience with transit agencies with them. So we're not so confident that they're available. Double-decker buses, there's They're running them in the UK. There's one that's coming as a demonstrator, so they know what their technology is, but there's no widespread experience with them yet. And the minibuses for Transpo could be one of the easier things to convert once the light truck chassis that we're using, once the kind of truck that underlies a minibus is a much more common truck for many other purposes than just for transit service. So when the technology hits GM and Ford and the other companies, and they start doing those light trucks as battery electric, then our suppliers will be able to figure out how to put a good passenger body on that chassis and offer them to us. So that's starting to happen, but we'll be watching to see how that goes. One of our big issues with Transpo is those buses run a ton of kilometers every day. They're all over the city. They're not just feeding into O-train stations. They're carrying people from the beginning of their trip to their end of their trip, and they're moving all day long. So they run a lot of kilometers in a day, and that might be different from a light vehicle that a manufacturer might be selling to a parcel company, where they're running from a depot to a zone and doing a lot of local drop-offs in that zone. Ours are crossing back and forth across the city all day long. So we will see what's available, but paratransit may turn into be a challenging application for battery electric light duty trucks.
Now, one of the last points I want to ask you about, again, referring to the report, it was mentioned that the initial buses would operate out of Saint Laurent garage, and over time, as more buses are replaced, that there could become an issue of the existing garage facilities not having enough space, and that there is uncertainty surrounding leaving the vehicles outside, especially in cold winter climates and all that. So coming back to your point earlier about all the infrastructure that needs to be put into place, obviously garage and facilities to house to accommodate these vehicles could also be another piece of the equation to be able to fully realize this conversion.
And there's a lot of considerations there. Saint Laurent garage is the place to go first, because many of the buses are stored indoors, and because Hydro Ottawa, who are a big part of this project, Hydro Ottawa has their own infrastructure in that area that allows them to get the volume of electricity we will need to Saint Laurent garage. So Saint Laurent is a great place to start because they've got capacity in their network in that part of the city. Industrial garage is also an easy spot for them to feed us electricity, but it's almost entirely outdoor storage, and the advice from the bus manufacturers right now is that it's best to in a cold climate, it's best to keep battery electric buses stored indoors. We can also do indoor storage at Merivale and Pinecrest garages, but they're less well located on the hydro network than Saint Laurent and Industrial are. So we know that Saint Laurent is the place to start. Where we go next will depend on a lot of considerations. Where is the electricity available? Can we park them indoors? Is the advice from the manufacturers still to park them indoors? Or are there other things you can do? Like, can you put a blanket on the bus that keeps the battery warm that you can plug in overnight that runs off the charging system? Is there anything else that they recommend? Can we put up baffles or roofs without building a whole garage? We will see what the manufacturers recommend and what everyone's experience is across the cold part of the continent. But if we're getting into articulated buses, we can still run some out of Saint Laurent. But if we get into double-decker buses in a few years, then that's really industrial garage that's got the place to maintain them, but they're primarily stored outdoors. And if Paratranspo minibuses become available and we start going down that road, they currently run out of Merivale, and maybe Hydro can get us enough power to charge those smaller buses there. But these are all, more tactical decisions that go on for the years to come that follow that major policy and strategic decision that council made.
My second last question is about the articulated buses. That's been a very noticeable and iconic part of transit in Ottawa, especially when the Transitway first opened with the original GM articulated buses and then the Orion Icarus and the new Flyers. Do you think there will ever be a day where articulated buses are a thing of the past in the city, or do you think that's always something that will still have some need moving forward no matter what, based on the passenger volume?
I wouldn't want to predict, forever, but they've certainly got, we need them now. We need them for the foreseeable future. They do more than one thing for us, right? They've been a practical requirement in order to serve downtown before the O train opened. We couldn't have moved as many people as we did if we were doing it all with 40-foot buses. They also save on operating costs, a little bit on fuel, but mostly on wages, because one operator can drive one bus that's carrying 70 people, let's say, rather than only 45 people. So, there's an economy of scale there, moving the people. Other transit systems, though, have gone for many years with no articulated buses in the fleet. They're very new. Toronto had a few and then got rid of them, and has got a few again. And they've managed to run a very high capacity system without a lot of articulated buses. They're getting back into them now. Similarly in Montreal and Vancouver. Vancouver now has a lot of articulated buses, but went a long time with everyone being moved on 40-footers. The advantage of a 40-footer, if you can overcome the operating cost, is they will come more frequently. If you've got a certain number of people to move, you can run a 40-foot bus every 5 minutes, an articulated bus every, let's say, 7.5 minutes, or double-decker bus every 10 minutes. They'll all let you move whatever number, 480, 600 people an hour. But the waiting time will be less if the vehicle is smaller. So there's an advantage to the smaller vehicles for a customer because their waiting time will be less. But that comes at a cost. And is that cost worth it? Is the waiting time shorter enough that it will drive ridership up to pay for that cost? Not usually, but possibly. Or are there places where articulated buses just aren't needed anymore? The articulated buses right now, we have more of them than 40-foot buses. So they're the biggest vehicle type that we have. And if you multiplied that out to 40-foot equivalents, they would be making an even greater fraction of our fleet. So we'll see how it goes. It really depends on capital costs, mostly on operating costs, and what the need is in future, and how much of the trunk system is replaced by train, because the trains are really the ultimate articulated bus, right? It's a vehicle that can move not just 45 people at a time, not just 70 people at a time, but all of a sudden you can move 600 people at a time. How extensive will the O-train network be? What plans will come after stage 2? And how will the city grow? How will the city change over that time? I imagine there'll always be some on the busy routes and on the long frequent routes.
I'd just like to close out, coming back one last time to the zero-emission buses. Can you just briefly go over the timeline as to when people will start seeing these buses introduced?
So the first 4 buses, the first 4 that we ordered last year, ordered in 2020 from New Flyer, should be here in the last part of this year. They should be here early to mid-fall. Don't know when they'll be here exactly. We'll put them through all their testing procedures, but they should be in service this year. And those, they'll be rare to see. That's, 4 buses, and maybe, we'll be doing a lot of engineering learning on them at the same time. So maybe there'll only be 2 or 3 out at a lot of times. So people will notice them and they'll stand out when they see them. The next order, currently we're thinking it's for 74 more buses. But we've got a lot of work to do. We've got to stand up that project team that I talked about. We've got to actually conclude the legal agreements with the CIB and with Infrastructure Canada. We've got to put together a good competitive procurement process so that all the manufacturers who supply in these fields can participate, and we can get a good bus for a good value. And then we've got to take our capital recommendations to City Council and have the 2022 capital budget adopted. So when you lay all those out, we'll be setting up the project team. We're talking about it this week. We'll carry on with our financial discussions, making sure that we get the agreement signed with the 2 federal agencies. We'll get that procurement started as fast as we possibly can once those other things are in place, or maybe in advance if we can avoid linking them too firmly. We'll get the capital decision made by council in towards the end of this year, and then if we've got the procurement in good shape by then, maybe we can place an order fairly early in 2022. And then the manufacturers will tell us how soon they can deliver. Usually buses are taking a year to get delivered from the, more or less a year from the time you place the order. So we can imagine that these next 74 buses from whichever manufacturer they're coming from could be here sometime in 2023. But we'll know much more we can predict that much more precisely once we get all of these preliminary tasks done one at a time. Then we'll be, they'll be here in 23, but before they're here, we'll be making decisions and recommendations to council on what to do for 24. And that's why it's important for us to get a good procurement package, a good procurement process going on, so that we know we've got good, healthy bids from all the manufacturers on all the bus types that we would need over the next few years.
Well, thank you very much for all this information. Pat Scrimgeour, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Shane.
And have a great summer ahead.
Thank you. Take care.